Hi guys, I am not Henrik Fåhraeus, the creator of Crusader Kings. Just a quick note, someone left a wallet in one of the seats here earlier. So if you've lost your wallet, that is now in the merch shop. So if you tell the people in the merch shop what your name is, and that matches up with what's in the ID on the wallet, they will give you your wallet back. What's that? If it's already empty, the wallet? Well, you'll have to see if you go claim it, I suppose. See if the money's still there. Sorry, what's that? Exactly, yeah. So you have 3 tries, and if you can get it on one of those, you get your wallet back. All right, so I'm going to bring Henrik out on stage, but just a quick reminder. On the other stage, Susanna, our COO, is currently sharing some of her best war stories from 15 years with Paradox. After that, Ebba Ljungerud, our new CEO, will be interviewed by Shams. So if you're interested in finding out more about who Ebba is, don't miss that. It's on the other stage in about 30 minutes. But now, Henrik Fåhraeus, Game Director, Crusader Kings 2. Welcome on stage.
Hi everyone. This little talk I'm about to hold is called Who Needs a Plot? Anecdotes from Crusader Kings 2. I think it would be more accurate to say that it's anecdotes in Crusader Kings 2, because it's really about emergent stories and how anecdotes can be a useful tool for game designers to create player stories, player narratives, and not developer stories. So this talk is actually a version of a talk I did at the GDC, both in San Francisco and in Cologne. And if you've seen that talk, well, it's nice if you stay, of course, right? But it's probably going to cover pretty much the same things. So just be prepared for that. Now, can you create drama without a plot? That's the question, right? And real life is pretty full of drama, but it has no script, it has no author, and yet we find so many events in real life meaningful. We stitch them together in our minds to form little stories that we remember, and an anecdote is, in my opinion, just such a story. It is a series of events that we assign meaning to and that we tend to remember and tell other people. And Crusader Kings 2, among many other games, tries to mimic this thing. It tries to give you these stories to remember in a complex simulation. And I will talk about how we do that in Crusader Kings 2, and I will talk about the form or the role that more traditional forms of narrative fill in sandbox-type games like Crusader Kings 2, because it can be a little bit awkward to fit the two things together. So why do people talk about emergent stories and emergent gameplay? What is the hype? Well, the thing about games, as opposed to other forms of entertainment like movies and books, is that they are interactive. It's kind of what defines a game. Games are interactive, movies and books are not. And the more interactive it is, the more replayable it is. And replayability is great, both for us as game developers. We want people to play our games. And hopefully players want to play games over and over again as well. The problem is that, or rather, games that emphasize a fixed plot are less interactive. That should be pretty obvious to everyone, right? It's like riding a train. From one point to another, you can shoot out the window, perhaps, but you're stuck on that train, the story train. So why do we even bother with plots? Why do we have written narrative in our games? I hear that, Minecraft and Candy Crush, they're doing pretty well, even if they don't have sort of a narrative. The problem is that if you don't have any kind of plot, any kind of side stories or quests or anything like that, your experience can feel flat and unengaging. It's sort of an abstract experience. So let's take a look at the various forms of narrative in gaming. First up, there's the linear narrative, obviously. It's used in books, it's used in plays and movies. A story is written down, and then it remains pretty much forever unchanging, unless you're George Lucas, who goes back and like changes stuff, right? But that's not the way it should work. Games with linear narrative are more movie-like. And like movies, they also allow for an extremely evocative, emotionally charged plot. It can be more like riding a roller coaster than a train, to return to that analogy. And you have like the exposition phase, rising action, a climax, falling action, and then sort of the after story. So it's also about pacing the player experience. Then there's the branching narrative. This is more interactive. It allows the player to make certain choices at certain points in the story, right? And a lot of game developers use this to good effect. It's more like being the driver on the train, and at some points along the ride, you can choose which path to take in the train track. But the problem is you have to create an enormous amount of content, right? Because you can play through any one branch really quickly. And the player might not see all the other good stuff that we put into the game. So it has its limitations. But if you can brute force this and just throw as much content as you can imagine into the game, this is a pretty perfect form of narrative, in my opinion. Then there's also, of course, improvised narrative. This is something that people do together. You can get together and create a story more or less on the fly. You don't need a predetermined plot. It can help to have some guidelines. In the real world, there's improv theater, there's role-playing. And in gaming, of course, there's like VR, like Second Life. There's MMOs, like EVE Online. And it's extremely interactive and highly engaging, and also very social. But the problem is, it takes effort out of the player. You need to create these things as you play the game. And of course, it's social, right? Which is not to everyone's taste. So finally, then, there is the emergent narrative, or player stories. If you have a complex enough simulation, players might perceive interesting stories even in a single-player environment. And this is where games like Crusader Kings 2 come in, but also huge blockbusters like The Sims. They don't really have a plot. Players play them to experience their own stories. And I think it's pretty interesting that the company as a whole has adopted a new slogan. I don't know if you've noticed that. We create the games, you create the stories. And it ties back to this whole kind of philosophy that we have at Paradox. The problem is that if we're being realistic, we can't live entirely without pre-written stories. Because of limitations, basically, to how advanced the simulation can be. It's pretty far from the real world still. Now, we really didn't know, or I didn't know anything about this theory, the theory of emergence and emergent stories or anything like that back in 2002 when we designed Crusader Kings 1. We just thought that if you threw a bunch of ruthless and power-hungry AI characters into a strategy game and had them fight each other in a sort of semi-random environment, interesting shit would happen, right? Interesting shit was the term we had for emergent narrative back in those days. Now, the original CK was not a huge commercial success, but I think it was, in a way, a great prototype. Oh, there it is. Fantastic. It was a great prototype for this kind of thinking, a simulation that could create stories. So with CK2, we had a slightly clearer vision of where to go to make even more interesting shit happen, right? So we tried to make it even more character-driven. The first CK still had a lot of thinking around nations, even if you played an actual character. So we ditched that. And we also made family more important. Tywin would approve, of course. All characters should have opinions and personalities. So we boiled down a lot of these game systems into the opinion mechanic of CK2 instead, and thought that will fill this need, and it's a simpler mechanic. And the game should feature a fairly ruthless amount of conflict, and I will get into that soon. And of course, I like chaos, I like randomness, I like the player to be surprised. So not all strategy games work like that, but I think it facilitates the emergence of stories if you don't exactly know what's going to happen. Chess would be the opposite, right? So this time it turned out a lot better than with CK1. I could never have believed the sheer success of CK2. It took the studio to a whole new level. And in part, it's why we can be here today and have PDXCON of this size. But it was a slow burner. Initially, it didn't really exceed our expectations or anything like that, but it just kept selling, and it still keeps growing. And it became more apparent than ever that what kept the game selling so well were these emergent stories, the little anecdotes the people experienced and told each other. So I personally found that very gratifying, because that's exactly what I hoped, in my wildest dreams at least, would happen. So let's take a look at what I mean by these emergent stories. And now, this is not exactly mechanically how it might work in CK2, but it's very close, right? So imagine that you're playing a vassal to a popular king. And you happen to be a claimant to the throne, or a pretender, it doesn't really matter. You're in line to the throne. So you decide to have him assassinated with poisoned wine. The king's little brother, who is very young, succeeds to the throne. But the queen mother becomes a regent, and through AI reasoning, perfectly logically, suspects you of this murder and tries to have you killed. But she only manages to wound you. Of course, you lose patience at this point and think, hey, I'm just going to revolt and take the throne by force. So that's exactly what you do. And then you throw the queen mother and her little whelp in the dungeon and let them both rot. And you think, hey, I won. But your wound festers, and then you die. And, you know, the old king got his vengeance in the end. And this is just one example among many, how a story has emerged for the player out of the perfectly logical actions of many AI characters, and the player himself, of course. You haven't really had much audio-visual feedback, and there's been very little text sort of emphasizing this story for you. But you still remember it, and you might want to tell your friends. Is this truly emergent stories, though? Or is it what has been called systems soup? That is, a series of interactions and events that do not really amount to much, lacking the tensions and the peaks and the pacing of a carefully crafted linear story or a plot. And in all honesty, Crusader Kings 2 is pretty full of system soup. But it has tasty dumplings, right? The AI characters in Crusader Kings 2, they don't just act in a plausible way, they also react fairly logically to whatever is going on in the game world. So while the emergent stories, the dumplings in the soup, usually lack proper narrative structure, they're still highly meaningful to the players, just in the same way that we can find meaning to stuff that happens to us in real life. And of course, you would know this, our forums are filled with these stories, these anecdotes of what people have experienced in their particular games in CK2. And it's fortunate for us that the human mind is so good at seeing patterns in meaningless noise. But You know, this is actually a psychological phenomenon called apophenia, and it can mark the onset of psychosis. Is this something we really want to do to our players? Are we trying to turn you guys into schizophrenics? Well, it would be cool if we could, right? But I don't think we could even if we tried. So what we provide is, in fact, something much more like a daydream or child's play, and nothing like psychosis. It's imagination and not hallucination. And another objection to attempting this kind of thing, to go with just emergent stories and not with a plot, is that there is no artistic expression behind it. There's no developer trying to sort of give you some experience. Well, it's not really true, though, because we as developers, we create the simulation itself in such a way that we expect you to experience certain types of stories. We create the fabula, everything around, everything that facilitates the story, essentially. So I don't buy it. So more exactly, what are we doing with this simulation to facilitate emergent stories? Well, as I briefly mentioned, the secret lies in the simulation itself, the mechanics of the simulation. It's not enough to offer a complex simulation, although that is necessary, I think. When you think about it, real life is the most complex simulation imaginable, or at least the most complex environment. And yet, most of the time, it is pretty uneventful and boring. Which is great for us in the games industry, right? Because we try to entertain. So complexity is necessary, but so is conflict. Most writers would agree that you need conflict for any good story. And that is why CK2 is intentionally crafted to facilitate conflict. So the principles basically go like these. The sheer quantity of agents. What do I mean by an agent? I mean an entity in the game that acts with the same agency as a player does. It's not really in a straitjacket or anything like that. It's trying to achieve the similar goals to the player. And I think in CK2 we have at least 30,000 living agents at any one point in time, which is a huge quantity. And the agents need quality, of course. They need to act in a plausible way that the player can understand, right? And that's probably the hardest part, but I will get into that a little bit more later. There should be some sort of limited resources, because again, remember, conflict, you need something to fight over. And this is natural in a strategy game. You know, you're fighting over land, and there's only so much land. But in other types of games, it's harder to do. I wonder what you'll fight over in The Sims. Maybe careers, right? Murder your boss. I don't know. It's hard, but it's pretty necessary. I also think you need changing conditions. And I talked about randomness and chaos. And you know, when you lay your plans, it's more interesting if something can throw a wrench into them and everything just falls apart. You need multiple courses of action. And that's good for the player, because an interesting game, a good game, will give the player many choices, interesting choices during the game. But it's also perfect for the AI. You know, if it's an intrigue-type character, you would expect it to gain its goals through intrigue, murdering and marrying into titles. And there need to be repercussions for your actions. And this is very important, and I think a lot of games forget this, that the game world needs to react and remember what has happened. You can do this in many ways, but I prefer the sort of structural approach. In CK2, you have claimants, for example. If you revoke a title of a character, he will have a claim on it, and he can make a comeback, and he remembers you, sort of, and he wants to get revenge. Which is related to the idea of a persistent cast. Which characters do you remember in CK? Well, probably the ones that caused you problems, right? So how can you make them come back? Because you will remember them, and if they do something yet again, they will become even more interesting and significant in your mind. And of course, my favorite, right? You need sort of low morals in the game. You can't do this in the Sims way, or maybe you could, but it's not going to be as good. You got to be. It's kind of a cheap trick in a way. If you allow the player to do really shocking things and really bad things can happen to you, it's going to be more memorable. Simple as that. So the quantity and the quality of the AI actors is perhaps the most important of those 2 points. And being CK players, you probably know a lot of this already, but every single non-player character in Crusader Kings 2 has an AI of sorts. And they will try to achieve the same types of goals that the player will. And unless they have a really rare combination of personality traits like craven and content, they will be ruthless, and they will attempt to take stuff and cause conflict. These personality traits, although the player cannot see it, each of them has an assigned numerical value in various personality fields, if you will, like zeal, rationality, and so on. So what we do is we add these values up, and that will drive a lot of the AI behavior. And of course, it's an area that we could improve a lot, where the player understands why the AI is actually doing things. But in the background, under the hood, it's actually driven by these numerical personality values. The other AI driving force in the game is, of course, the opinion system. All characters have an opinion of every other character, and for pretty clear reasons. We do a better job here explaining why characters think the way they do, or why they regard you the way they do, I should say. So in everything from diplomatic actions to its choices in scripted events, because remember, the AI gets mostly the same kind of events the player does, it uses these personality values and opinions to make its choices. Now, coming from the strategy game genre like I do, it feels so natural to do this. It feels so natural to fill the game world with a bunch of characters who fight each other. However, it's a strangely rare thing to see this in other types of games. And I don't know why they're not really exploring that further. So it's become a little bit of a crusade of mine whenever I meet other game developers to push this agenda I have. Because I think that AI actors who act with agency, remember, are really crucial for the rise of these player stories in your mind, stuff that you remember. And it's very gratifying to see that at least some AAA studios are going in this direction. So in games like Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, the orc captains might not actually be fighting over limited resources or anything like that, but at least it appears that way to the player. So it's perfectly okay to use like smoke and mirrors if you can achieve this effect for the player, because that's all that matters. So why do we bother with the written narratives that we have? Do we need all these events that we have crafted? Well, if you recall the advantages of linear and branching narrative, they add pacing to the game and tension. They're highly evocative, engaging, and so on. And our little scripted stories are not actually crucial to the gameplay. They're not really what the game is about. The game is a strategy game. It's a simulation. But they serve to spice things up. They help with immersion and to describe the world. Sorry. To describe the world as you don't actually get to see it. You can imagine that you are there in your castle, talking to your courtiers, raising your kids, scheming, and so on. And of course, if you're playing in some culture, we can add spice to that as well, and add cultural references to Robin Hood if you're in England, or Alibaba, or whatever. So they do serve a purpose. If you have a strong simulation, a strong complex simulation that facilitates conflict, etc., with AI actors, of course, that can actually pursue real goals. You can rely on them to do the hard lifting. You don't need to write finished stories. You can write pieces of a story. If you can identify the kernels of really archetypical stories, it's enough to write these little pieces and rely on the simulation to stitch them together for you. And I think this is what we're doing the most in CK2. We don't care if we leave plot lines hanging. You can see a part of the demon child story unfold, and then we hopefully can trust other things to make that story more interesting, stuff that happens in the actual simulation. So this is our model. It's a hybrid model. We use linear, or rather branching narratives, and emergent stories. And of course, it's highly interactive still. It's quite evocative, but I guess it's not really pure. And the pacing of things is still a lot worse than what you would get in a plot-driven game. So that's something to work on. The important thing, though, the sort of keywords here, is not to sacrifice player autonomy and freedom, right? The player wants to be free by forcing them through a long constructed plot. But on the other hand, also do not completely abandon them to the power of their own imagination. There are, of course, counterexamples. There are games of both types, but I think a stronger approach is this one, or at least it's my feeling that it is. So this is our recipe then for emergent drama. Sandbox gameplay. It should be open-ended, preferably. I wish CK2 wouldn't end. I don't like the fact that it has an end date. That's sort of a beauty spot with the system. It should have a great many AI actors, as many as you can. And these actors should have opinions and sort of personalities. It doesn't have to be characters. It could be countries or some other kinds of factions, as long as they're there and they actually have agency similar to the player. You need some changing conditions. The fact that you can be playing a very skilled, good monarch who suddenly dies, and then, this little moron kid takes over. Those are the kind of things that make it interesting and surprising for the player. And remember, conflict. Don't try to create emergent stories without conflict, because I think it's much harder. And of course, low morals. Don't be afraid. Go there. I think CK2 is PG-12. I talked more about that last year. But it really shouldn't be, right? So the takeaway. I mentioned the word emergent 1,000 times, but what it really is a player story, right? It's not a developer story, it's a player story. And you can think of them simply as anecdotes from a game world. And I think emergent stories, emergent gameplay in general, allow for an enormous amount of replayability. And I wish to see this more in role-playing games and in action games and all kinds of games, really. And I believe in the plausibility and empowerment of AI actors. They shouldn't just be sort of plot devices. They should actually be fighting you in the game for real. Makes it more interesting. So again, get off the plot train, especially if you're another games developer, because there's a whole other world out there. Okay, guys. That's pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions regarding this?
I'm going to ask you guys to line up by the mic here, because I think that's the easiest way to do this. And we have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. Go on.
Hey, I just wanted to ask whether you would foresee more emphasis on multiplayer and how having more human actors in this soup would affect the narrative, and whether the same sort of emphasis on ruthless backstabbing would make sense in a narrative with many human players, like, say, an MMO, but that's not entirely what I meant.
Right, so do I see a need to emphasize that more? Was that the question, sort of?
Does the formula change when you have many humans, not just one?
Right. I really like games where there are several humans, but not massively so. Right. I think that's a good, for me, that's a good mix. Because you can choose these people. They're not going to grief you or be in the way or out of character or anything. I prefer a couple of people playing together, friends and so on. And I definitely want to do that more. I think CK could be much better at multiplayer, especially cooperative multiplayer. I think would suit CK and this emergence of stories very well. The problem with competitive multiplayer in CK, or one of the problems, of course, is that it's so easy to kill someone off or just destroy their life completely. Which is fun in a way, but hey. Right.
I had a question regarding, as I'm looking to pick which character I'm going to play, I'm really fascinated of how accurate the landed characters are. Every single start date, you know exactly which character owns which land and is married to whom, to the accuracy of the day. And I've heard that many people on the subreddit, the CK2 subreddit, and they're talking about how this has actually helped them through education, because many who study the history at high school and college, they have often used knowledge from CK2 to excel in their studies. And I wondered, since many have thought of the idea of introducing games to education, have you considered the idea of creating a program where a teacher could use CK2, where they could be observers and say, this is what happened at exactly this time, these characters owned this piece of land at this start date, and etc. etc.
Right. So basically, have we considered using our games like a form of edutainment in schools, where you can actually learn about historical events and how the characters behave? Is that
something along those lines? Yeah.
Yeah. We considered that in the early days of Europa Universalis 1 and 2, and I think some teachers in Sweden, at least, did use those games for their history lessons and so on. But we never really made any business decision to go along those lines. But then again, I got into Europa Universalis 1 because I was so fascinated in history, and I thought this game was uniquely historical. But it's not really, in terms of emergent stories, right? It's more important that characters behave according to their personality than that they have an accurate personality, so to speak.
So this is not exactly a question. When I was starting on Crusader Kings 2, I felt like I was playing, well, a role-playing game, but not in the sense of an RPG on a computer, because those are more like interactive movies, I guess, if they are very story-driven. You click on buttons, but there is a story written by someone else. And when I was in Crusader Kings 2, I felt like I was playing a tabletop role-playing game, more like with a game master, in that I was playing a character the way I wanted it to be. I had events that affected him, but it was always fresh, like as if there was a new story every time, but the computer did it instead of a human being. And that is really what hooked me in CK2. That those storylines were always springing up, and when you looked at the map, you could also imagine those stories taking place between AI characters.
Right. I absolutely agree. And I did mention that linear narrative has the advantage of proper pacing and like forming tension for the player before something happens, right? And that's a bit what we are missing. A dungeon master or game master would do that for his role-playing group. right? So if we could, or if I could, I would like to explore that more. Some games are doing it. They have a director for the player, right? And I think that CK could probably benefit from something a little bit similar. Then again, when I play RimWorld, for example, I always pick Randy Random, because I like it that way.
In a way, the randomness of CK2 makes it true, more so than linear stories. In real life, randomness happens all the time, and no plans comes together perfectly.
Yeah,
even in linear stories that can happen, but not in CK2.
I would really like to mimic real life as much as possible, except cut out all the pieces of boredom and allow you to do anything you want to do. Right? That's the fantasy. So that's the goal. That's the end goal. You shouldn't have to read any text or anything. You should just experience this. Right?
So you've mentioned during your talk sort of a reliance on clever enough AI in order to achieve emergent gameplay, because obviously you need to, in a single-player space, interact with beings. So are you planning to capitalize in the future on deep learning technologies to sort of make those entities even smarter and more organic, I suppose?
I would love to hire someone who can help us do that. It's very, very advanced and complex stuff, but yeah, I can see that in the future, absolutely. AI fascinates me, and I think we could make good use of that. I really do. I wouldn't say that we rely on the AI actors being clever exactly, though. They should act in a way that is amusing and entertaining to the player more than anything.
And on the same line, I mean, you just mentioned Dungeon Master. I guess it could sort of function in a similar way, having a coordinator, some higher spirit in the form of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good idea.
Thank you for the very interesting talk, and also
Thanks.
the many hilarious hours I had with CK2. To the question, when you brought these societies in, what was it, Monks and Mystics, I think?
Yeah.
I would say that's more part of this branching path, scripted sort of storytelling that we have there. Do you think that was a successful addition to the soup, or is it more of a separate thing?
Are you referring to the societies themselves or to the associated events?
Mostly to the events.
Right. More is more, basically. If you do them the right way and they don't become repetitive or spammy, right? Because that's a big no-no. That's a big disadvantage with having these written narratives as well, is that they get repetitive. You've seen them before, right? So, and we've passed that line in CK2 a long time ago. There's too much spam, right, going on. So I guess an answer could be we've gone a bit overboard, right? I would like to tone it down a bit and rely more on the actual simulation. So.
I agree. Really enjoyed the first Lucifer's run, and then never again.
Yeah, well, ideally.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. It's related to the previous question on AI. I just wonder, in general, what kind of the technology advances are you looking forward that can better the way that your the emergent narrative works? I mean, of course, better computing power means more characters. But apart from that, what kind of technological advance that you're looking forward to?
Well, right now, I think we're more prioritizing the player experience. Do you really, as a player, understand why an AI declared war on you, always, in CK2? Do you know the underlying reasoning for that? Those are things that are easier. It's lower hanging fruit, right? So right now, I'm looking more at those kind of things.
Thank you.
And I have a question about time management in creating the AI agents. How much time do you spend on making them efficient and making the decisions quick enough compared to making them do complex and interesting decisions?
All right, so that's more of an optimization question, I guess.
Yeah, and optimization compared to both good decisions and making them quick enough to function in a game.
Right. Well, we've come a huge way since we released CK2. I mean, it was a much, much slower game back then. Now we can probably handle a lot more characters. Also, computer power has gone up since then, obviously. But we don't spend that much time optimizing the AI as such. That's not usually what's costing CPU, basically. Originally, when I designed Jade Dragon, I wanted to actually add China, though, and the territory. And one of the considerations, I admit, was the number of characters. It would slow down the game, and I basically made a policy decision that we should never release a patch that was slower than the previous one. But that's not the main reason. The main reason was that it was simply too hard to come up with this bureaucratic, meritocratic system of governance that China had and do that justice. Cool. More questions?
Okay, hello first. You've said repeatedly that CK2 was a game changer at Paradox Development Studios. It was a surprise for you to see how much successful it was, and it has changed a lot of things in the way you develop your games, the way you add content to it. And it shows in the ways it was developed for CK2 specifically, but you can tell nowadays with Stellaris or with Hearts of Iron that you have a roadmap. You know where you're going. You're starting from a particular base and then you build on it from the start. When the time will come to develop CK3, so in 2025, what would be, you think, your base?
Yeah, this is one of the questions I get the most, really. And it's difficult to answer. Ideally, I would, of course, like to take CK2 and everything in it and just build on that, right? It has many, many issues, though. To do that would mean that we would have to keep a lot of ugly, hackish code and weird exceptions to the rules and all kinds of stuff that I want to get rid of, really. So I think we would go some sort of middle route. We would cut out a lot of the less successful features, and we would make the game more accessible and more streamlined. And then we would start over from there. But it would definitely be a game that contained more stuff than CK2 did on release. Right.
Can you share an anecdote where the emergence surprised you?
The emergence surprised me. Well, it surprises me all the time. And I think one of the people who asked the question here earlier said that it's fun to look at what the AI characters have been up to, right? The fact that you can look at the title history and see how people got a title and so on means that you can sort of track people from a wildly distant culture getting the throne in Ireland, like some Indian. How did he end up there? Why is there a Carling alive in 1500 somewhere in Spain? It's like those kind of things. Just looking at that after the fact, right? For me, that happens all the time, and I love doing that as well. So it's not just about playing and experiencing it. You can sort of track back and see what has been going on in the world. The whole world is living, and that's something I'd like to see. I actually talked to some people at Ubisoft about this recently. You know, I'd love to see that in their games. How awesome would that be, right? That the people in this world, in Far Cry or whatever, are actually fighting each other for real, right? Not just for show for the player and so on. That's not exactly one example, but it's, yeah.
Do we have any final questions for Henrik? All right.
Cool.
Thanks very
guys.
much. And You're around if people want to ask you more questions about plot lines in CK2 and release dates for CK3?
Yeah, of course. I'll spill all the beans, right? No, today I'm pretty busy with interviews and stuff. Tomorrow I should have more free time. And of course I'll be here at the party tonight as well.
Cool. Thanks a lot.